Welcome to Let's Just Talk. I'm your host, Hami. Joining us today is Dr. Claire Wardle to discuss the relationship between war, misinformation, and disinformation. Dr. Claire Wardle here is the co-founder and co-director of the Information Futures Lab and the professor of practice at Brown University School of Public Health. Dr. Wardle, welcome to Let's Just Talk.
Thanks for having me.
Of course, thanks for being here. So, as you've made it abundantly clear throughout your work, every single topic that we deal with has an element of misinformation, disinformation, malinformation, something with information. So I wanted to begin today's conversation on a broader level for you to define for us what information disorder is and what are the different types of information disorders.
So the first thing to say is, as humans, we've always been drawn to false and misleading information, right? Like there's this great study that says, how do humans connect? Well, other animals pick like fleas off each other. We can't do that, so we gossip, right? So we have to say this isn't new. But the reason that we've become kind of obsessed with this challenge of information disorder in the last 20 years, really, is because we now have the tools to create this kind of content very, very cheaply, if not free. And we have the tools to disseminate this across borders in seconds, right?
Mm-hmm.
So previously, if I lived in a village and I said, oh, have you heard who's having an affair with somebody else? Like I couldn't really travel, right? Like
Right.
it didn't have an easy way to travel. So when we
Right.
talk about information disorder, it impacts everything, every topic that we care about, because we now live in an information environment where we have the tools for
Mm-hmm.
us to create and publish ourselves. We've never had that before, right? You had to, the Gutenberg press came along, which allowed more people to publish, but we'd never had something like the smartphone. So now on any topic, anybody can lie. And we need to start the place that is all legal speech, right?
Mm-hmm.
Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, First Amendment. But that means that anybody can say anything about anyone or any issue, and they can pretend to be anyone.
Right.
So that means that we live in this polluted information environment. So sometimes there are people who deliberately want to create false and misleading information to cause harm. They're disinformation actors.
Mm-hmm.
And then we have people like my mum who take that content and reshare it, not realizing that it's false. That's misinformation.
Right.
And malinformation is what I call genuine information that's shared to cause harm. That might be something like revenge porn or leaking emails not in the public interest.
Mm-hmm.
So that's genuine content, but it's designed to cause harm. So there's all sorts of different ways that the information ecosystem is disordered, and it impacts every single issue that we care about today.
Okay. So just to clarify the difference between these different type of informations, disinformation is spreading lies or intentionally with the intent to cause harm.
Yes.
Misinformation is spreading false information unintentionally, but maybe believing that that information is true.
Yes.
And malinformation is sharing genuine, real, factual information, but with harmful intent.
100%.
Okay. Now that we have that pinned down,
10 out of 10.
Thank you. Now that we have that pinned down, I want to talk about the mechanisms of misinformation, disinformation, malinformation, all these different, I'm going to stop saying different types of information, but what are the tactics and techniques out there to spread this content?
So the thing that we should all know is that when you put people in laboratories under experimental conditions, humans are pretty good at figuring out what's true and false. Like we're pretty good at like, is this accurate? Is this trustworthy? We can do that. But when we're in a situation when we're not stressed, we're not standing in line for a coffee and frustrated, we're not overwhelmed by our feeds pinging us notifications, that is when we're really bad at this. So if I'm somebody who's trying to encourage false information to be spread, my number one thing I want to do is to make you angry, frightened, feel superior, feel smug. I want you to feel something, because the more that you have an emotional elevation, your critical thinking skills, even though you have them, go out of the window. So the most effective tactic is creating content that makes the audience have a strong emotional response, and that tends to be fear or anger. And then I'm going to use things called heuristics, right? So when I'm overwhelmed, if I see a logo that I already recognize, like the BBC, I'm going
Right.
to be less likely to check because my brain relies on these heuristics, which is like, oh,
Right.
I already know the BBC, so it's fine. Or somebody wearing a white coat in a YouTube video. Oh, that's a
Mm.
doctor. I can trust them. So the tactics and techniques are ways to basically override
Right.
our brains, which are normally pretty good.
Right.
We're just really bad when we're tired, when we're feeling lazy, when we're feeling
Right.
angry, when we're feeling scared, when we feel that we're definitely right.
Right.
That's when we're not able to make those judgment calls.
And so this also speaks to why we are, as humans, are susceptible to this kind of, to falling for these kind of tactics.
Yeah,
Okay.
exactly.
Now that we have definitions pinned down, is there anything else that I'm missing in terms of defining and understanding how the information ecosystem is polluted?
So I'm glad you asked that question because I wrote something last year basically saying that I felt like my three types didn't necessarily capture the complexity of the situation, right? So if we think about the people who stormed the Capitol on January 6th,
Mm-hmm.
were they people who were deliberately creating and sharing false information to cause harm? No, they thought they were defending the Constitution.
Mm-hmm.
Were they also people who were mistakenly sharing information because they didn't check? No, they knew that DHS had said the election was secure. They were neither of those things, right? They were in an alternative information reality
Right.
where they believed that they were protecting democracy and securing the Constitution.
Right.
Similarly, if you spend time in anti-vax communities, they're sharing content thinking that vaccines cause harm, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're trying to prevent harm. So the more I spent time, I just kept thinking, my very simplistic Venn diagram that looked nice in an academic article
Mm-hmm.
doesn't actually capture people who now really deeply believe
Right.
things that are, we know we have evidence to show it's not true, but they are part of this belief system
Right.
that is, they're in an alternative information reality. So I think these kind of simplistic, is it disinformation? Is it misinformation? That made sense in 2016. It
Right.
does not capture everything that's happening in 2024.
Right. And I think that also speaks to the fact that because we have access to everything online, um, people tend to look for things that confirm their biases or predisposed assumptions about things and the world. That brings us to uh, why we're here today, which is the role of this kind of pollution of the information ecosystem in warfare, or it being used by states to impact the information ecosystem or to pollute it or to shape public opinion in certain kind of ways. So
Yeah.
I want to take a second for you to discuss how governments, institutions, politicians, people with power use this kind of tools to sort of affect the public in certain kind of directions.
Yeah, it's really important we have this conversation because in the last 7 or 8 years, of course, everybody's obsessed with Russian disinformation, Chinese disinformation, Iranian disinformation, and we'll get to that. And certainly they are well resourced and they are doing all sorts of things. But
Right.
that does not mean that the US is not doing similar things, the UK isn't doing similar things, because this has always been part of war.
Mhm.
I mean, I have a communications PhD. My field emerged after World War II because of this recognition of how Nazi Germany used propaganda
Mhm.
to convince people, otherwise good people, to do horrendous things, right?
Mhm.
And so, but if we think about the role of propaganda, it has always been there.
Right.
Now, of course, propaganda was something that only countries could do.
Mhm.
Now people are like, well, where's propaganda start and stop? Where does disinformation start and stop? But certainly any conflict, there is always a recognition that information plays a key role. I
Mhm.
think what we're seeing most recently in the Middle East is the first time on both sides there is a recognition that information is absolutely a key part of the
Mhm.
toolbox.
Right.
Beyond other military weapons,
Right.
information is another one of those. But that didn't start in 2023, 2024. This has always been an issue. It's just the tools are much cheaper and people have become more savvy about how to do this
Mhm.
effectively.
And I think to speak to the magnitude of how everybody is so susceptible to this, at the highest level, we have the president of the United States going on national, international news and saying that he's seen with his own eyes that there are 40 beheaded babies when this was a thing in uh, in the beginning of Israel offensive on Gaza, and everyone ran with it. And then we had major news outlets retracting and coming back and saying, actually, this was misinformation. So now for me, it's like, how do we place that? Are our leaders intentionally doing this, thus making it disinformation? Or is it that they also receive bad information and reshared it, making it misinformation, you know?
Yeah, and I mean that's a great example of like when do these labels like stop being helpful, right? Because I think this is such an important point is that at the start of this conflict, we didn't have the conversation which we would have done in previous wars to be like the fog of war is a thing. During the
Mhm.
Vietnam War, we had to rely on embedded journalists going to the front and then we had to wait for the pictures to come back and then see them. The Gulf War, we had some like reporters were on the roofs of hotels because they weren't allowed to go anywhere else. We
Mhm.
haven't had journalists in Gaza other than the amazingly brave Gazan journalists doing this work. We should have said, we can't tell immediately who bombed a hospital. We can't tell immediately what was
Mhm.
happening on the ground in the music festival. We should just have said, in this moment, nobody should say anything.
Right.
Because previously a president could say something and we didn't have TikTok or X or anything else to fact check, right? So people would have taken that statement and just been like, well, it must be true because the president said it. Now we live in a world where we recognize much, much more quickly, which is why the information ecosystem is also has real benefits now. It's
Mhm.
awful, but it's also brilliant at the same time.
Right.
So now in the conflict zone, we should be even more careful because very quickly people can say, no, that's not true, President Biden, or whatever it is. So, but
Right.
I just wish, because we're so used to picking up our phones and immediately getting an answer,
Mhm.
nobody wants to be told, I can't give you answers about what's happening right now in Gaza. I don't have any journalists on the ground. We're doing what we can, but it might take a couple of days to get verifiable information. But
Right.
instead, we have this hunger and demand for like real-time updates, which just isn't possible in all situations. And we
Mhm.
saw the damage that was done just after October 7th around the hospital bombing and the
Mhm.
claims around beheaded babies in a way that was just deeply problematic and also caused people to lose trust in anything and be like, oh,
Right.
I don't know who to trust, and pulling away from reading about the conflict, which was it has its own damage.
Right. And so this another thing that I wanted you to speak on in terms of trust, right? In terms of strategies to recognize when there are deliberate state-driven strategies to produce some sort of misinformation and disinformation, because at the end of the day, that serves some purpose, right? Like when when I get a news that 100 or so people have been massacred, and I can read that and be like, yeah, I can't trust it. I don't care if it's coming from New York Times, BBC, NBC, whatever. See, I can't trust it. They've lied to me before. What reason do I have to trust this anymore? Or when, victims of sexual violence from like October 7th come out and say, hey, like I experienced this, we can be like, yeah, we don't trust that anymore because your government has lied about this, this, and that.
Yeah.
So then how do we recognize that when things are authentic and real? Because now we don't trust the media, we don't trust the politicians, we don't trust the individuals that it's coming from. It's just we're here and our hands are sort of tied.
Yeah, and it gets to the heart of the thing that really keeps me up at night, right? Like I'm less concerned about the fake or fabricated content. I'm
Mhm.
more concerned about the loss of trust in institutions that in democratic societies we need in order for democracies to flourish and to be sustained, right?
Mhm.
So yes, when I see news organizations make mistakes, I get triply angry because there is no space for mistakes now. There's no mistakes that a leader can make a claim and then 2 days later, oh, sorry, I was wrong. Like we're like hanging on to threads around trust, right? Whether it's in the CDC or the government or the news media. When I hear my students say, yeah, I don't trust anybody. I don't know who to trust anymore. So I don't consume content at all. I'm like, that's not the answer. Like, if we look to a place like China, people don't talk about politics because it's dangerous. And so people talk about real estate price. Like that can't be our society. Like we have to engage with this. And so to me, we have to engage with institutions, even when they are sometimes flawed. We have to
Mhm.
hold these news organizations accountable when they make mistakes. We need to ensure that they're verified before they publish. But we also need to say, it's all right, New York Times, you don't have to tell us immediately who bombed the hospital, because I'd rather wait than you be wrong.
Mhm.
Like that's what we need people to
Right.
recognize, is that we need strong news organizations, but we can't have them messing up because it's too dangerous.
Okay. And then for our sake, since we're coming towards the end, how do we recognize, right, when there are deliberate state-driven strategies um, taking place, right? Whether it is from Israel, the United States, or groups like Hamas, or any entity that is in the business or has historically been in the business of misleading the public. How do we recognize, like, what are some tools that we can use to be like, yeah, that thing that that prime minister is saying, can't trust it.
So I would say, if we're thinking about an active conflict as we are right now in the Middle East, I mean, Hamas is doing an incredible job using Telegram with very professional videos. I mean, they have really understood the importance of information. On Israel's side, IDF have always been very good at using social media for advantage. But one example from early on is that IDF put out an image of a man in fatigues next to Taylor Swift, basically making the claim that he had been a bodyguard for Taylor Swift and then left the tour to come back to Israel to serve. Well, people did a little bit of searching, and of course, he wasn't a bodyguard for Taylor Swift. He had been a security guard at one of the stadiums that she happened to be at, but he wasn't the bodyguard for Taylor Swift. But that was such a beautiful, very clever, strategic use of the love of Taylor Swift, trying to connect it to what was happening and people coming back to Israel to serve.
Mhm.
Now, that's just going to happen in war, right? Both sides are going to say, we need to shore up support for our position. And I'm not critical of that. That's just war. And that has always been the case. But if
Yep.
you're a consumer of information on TikTok or Instagram, whatever, if it's coming from either of the sides that are in the middle of an active conflict, every one of your senses should be like, why are
Mhm.
they posting that? Let me double check. There is
Right.
a reason that they want us to support us, right? Like, just all your critical faculties should be doubly alert.
Right.
When it comes to the upcoming election in the US, how will I know whether something I see is potentially part of a foreign interference campaign? It's going to
Mhm.
be very difficult to tell.
Right. And stay tuned because our next episode will be on misinformation, disinformation as they relate to elections. So, with the development of AI and deepfakes and so on, how does that play a role into what we're seeing unfold across the globe?
So, generative AI, deepfakes, the ability to create imagery, video, audio, it's been around since 2017, 2018. And we've obviously been concerned around the kind of content that's being created. But what has been completely devastating for me, particularly as we watch the war unfold in the Middle East, is watching people see graphic content of the demolition of a building in Gaza or a baby being carried out and immediately saying, oh no, that's a deep fake. Right.
Mm,
So that's my bigger concern, is people losing trust in photography or videography, which previously had always been seen as evidence.
right.
Right. We never questioned. We might talk about the framing, but ultimately, photos or video was evidence that often got used for documenting war crimes. The
Right.
idea that people would see difficult graphic content and immediately say, oh, I think that's just AI.
Right.
That's a really dangerous part where people say, I can't trust anything anymore.
Right. And I've seen this like play out in real life too, with like there's a Palestinian journalist named Motaz who has done, heroic work documenting some of the atrocities taking place in Gaza. And I've seen someone literally repost and be like, it's fake. And I'm like, how can you watch this? Like, I don't know any word to describe the inhumanity of it and be like, this is fake and it's deep fake. And, it speaks to your concern. But then again, how do we move beyond concern of like, this is happening. People are not trusting things that are actually coming from, because when you were speaking about trusting information, right? And taking a second, I was going to reply to that and say that a way that we can find credible sources is from the people actually on the ground, who don't have time to go and edit something or rework it. But now you're saying even those people on the ground, we're more likely not to trust them because someone is going to say it's AI or it's deep fake or it's made up.
So I think what we have to do is have a conversation as society about, as humans, we don't want to see the hard reality. Like the people who are like, I don't trust that it's deep fake, is because they don't want to believe that that level of atrocity is happening. So we have to say, if our gut instinct is to say, oh, it must be AI, why are we having that human instinct? And to say, we need to look closer, we need to look again, we need to Google it to say, are we sure that this didn't happen? If we Google it, we'll find that that hospital or that building was demolished and that baby was, so I think we have to say to people, we can't, unfortunately, in this information ecosystem, we can't automatically trust anything, but we can't automatically distrust anything.
Okay.
Right? Because
So
AI
striking
now
that
creates,
balance of not
yes,
automatically trusting, but also not automatically detrusting.
exactly.
But thank you so much again for being here. I truly appreciate your time. I hope we had more time to discuss this, but we will meet again to talk about misinformation, disinformation as they relate to elections, and as things keep unfolding in Ukraine and parts of the Middle East. I will have you back on again to talk about strategies for understanding what's out there in the media ecosystem.
I look forward to it.